Test Review, Unit 1A, Question 10. Let's estimate the extremes of the graphs below and state whether they are local and or absolute or global, and if it is a minimum or maximum. All right, the first thing I want to do is talk about what is an extreme. An extreme is where my graph is changing direction. I can see that my graph is changing direction. It's going from decreasing to increasing here. So there's one of my local minimums. Increasing to decreasing here, there's a maximum. Decreasing to increasing, there's another minimum. All right, so now let's talk about the three types that there are on this graph. Here I see one of my points is right here, and one of the points is right here, and I'm going to call these my local mins, and they are local because my graph is going from decreasing to increasing. So here's my local mins. I have two of them, and those 2 points are at a -2, -1, and a 2, -3. So those are those 2 points. Now I also have another point that I talked about where my graph goes from increasing to decreasing, and that's this point up here. And so this would make it a local max. And in this case I have one local max, and my local max is at a 0, 1. The next thing that my question asks though is if I have an absolute max or minimum point. And absolute, as I tell my students, you can only have one absolute truth. So there can be, on any one graph, there can only be one maximum point that is absolute and one absolute minimum point. So the question is, do I have either of those on this graph? Where if I look at the maximum, I can see that my arrows on both of these sides go up, and they go up to infinity and beyond, and they're going in two different directions here, but they're both going to that positive infinity. And I see, well, if it's going to infinity, it's not going to a specific point. So I would say, no, there is no absolute maximum point because you can never touch infinity. But if I look at the bottom of my graph, I see that it crosses down here and that there is no other lower part on my graph. So that is the absolute minimum of my graph. So I do have one absolute. So I'm going to write that out. My absolute minimum, absolute min, is at that point to -3. And you're going to notice that my absolute min can also be a local min. So I'm going to have a local min at 2, -3 and an absolute min at 2, -3. So I have two local mins on this graph, one local max, one absolute minimum, and no absolute maximums.